Okay, welcome back, class. Let's take a look at the neuromuscular junction, the NMJ, the neuromuscular junction. So, muscles and muscle cells are going to be stimulated to contract by somatic motor neurons. When we talk about neurons, neurons can be motor neurons or they can be sensory neurons, motor and sensory. So simple difference to help you understand a little bit of neurology before we're there. Let's say here's the brain and here's the spinal cord. And let's say here's a nerve going to some muscle. Okay. The brain can send information down the spinal cord to the nerve to the muscle. The muscle gets that information and it can send a signal from the muscle to the nerve to the spinal cord and up to the brain. So it's a two-way street, right? Impulses can go from the brain down to the cells and the tissues and the organs, or it can go from the cells, tissues, and organs up to the brain. When the information descends, we call it motor neurons. When the information ascends and goes up, it's called sensory neurons. Okay, so we're going to focus on motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons are the neurons that go from the brain down the spinal cord to the nerve to the muscle. These are voluntary. You can consciously control them. The neurons that make contact at the muscle, that specific region is called the NMJ, the neuromuscular junction. So this is a somatic motor neuron. And it has some branches. It has some axon collateral branches. And at the end of that axon, at the end of the axon, here's another axon collateral. And then towards the end, there's a terminal. It's called an axon terminal. And at the very, very end of the terminal are the synaptic end bulbs. Synaptic end bulbs. And what we have at the synaptic end bulbs are something we called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters can be excitatory or inhibitory, right? It can be an on switch or an off switch. You can turn something on or off, excitatory or inhibitory. At the neuromuscular junction, there's a neurotransmitter that's always excitatory, and it's called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. ACH, acetylcholine. That's why eggs are so important to eat, because eggs, especially the egg yolk, very high in choline, also high in B vitamins. So eggs are one of those perfect foods. So acetylcholine, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. What other neurotransmitters do we have? Just to give you an idea, when you get up in the morning, okay, when you get up in the morning and your alarm goes off and you can wake up and spring out of bed, have a smile on your face, hop in the shower and say, I can't wait to take on the day. That's glutamate. That's the accelerator. Now, glutamate, this neurotransmitter, over time throughout the day, as the sun goes down, the flowers close up, glutamate becomes another neurotransmitter called GABA, which is inhibitory. Glutamate is the accelerator, GABA is the brake. When you get up in the morning, we want glutamate, but at the end of the day, when we go to sleep, we want GABA to kind of calm us down, to calm the brain down. If you have too much glutamate at night, you can't sleep. Your brain is wired. You got all that information going on in there. If you can't get up in the morning, it could mean that you're glutamate deficient and you're GABA dominant. Like, yeah, I got to hit the snooze button. Give me 5 more minutes, another minute. Oh my goodness, right? So this just to make an analogy, in terms of neurotransmitters, that some are acceleratory, they're the on switch, and some are off switches, and we need a balance of both. At the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is always excitatory. It's going to make muscles contract. So there's going to be some terms that you're going to be hearing. So I want to give you a good visual of what we're looking at here. Remember all those muscle cells? Well, those are the myofibrils that we see going through here, right? We can see these lines here. And the myofibrils, some of the biggies that we're going to talk about are going to be actin and myosin. These are going to be two protein filaments through here that we're going to talk about. And they're two real big ones when we talk about the sarcomere. And the sarcomere is what we're looking at here. It is the functional unit of muscle. It's the functional unit of muscle. So myofibrils are here. Notice muscles have lots of mitochondria because muscles are always contracting, and mitochondria, we know, produce ATP, which is energy. We have a T tubule. This T tubule, the T stands for transverse tubule. And if you look, this structure and this structure here, they run transversely to everything else going left to right. So the blue meshwork, this blue network, that blue tubular spider web looking thing is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is really important because it's going to store calcium. What is the sarcoplasmic reticulum's function? Well, it's really important. It's going to store calcium. And calcium is a really important mineral when it comes to muscle contraction. Calcium is involved with clotting, nerve impulse, muscle function. It's involved with a lot of things. Okay. Notice that the sarcoplasmic reticulum comes into contact with the transverse tubule. See that? So action potentials or nerve impulses are going to send signals down through this transverse tubule, and then it's going to spread across through the blue sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium, so it's going to release calcium, and the calcium is going to have some effect on these myofibrils. Okay, that's an important concept there. All right, so now let's take a look at the neuromuscular junction. Let me change this to black here. All right, so here, what we're looking at the top left, we're looking at an axon collateral of a somatic motor neuron, right? This is a neuron, and we can see that you have these axon terminals at the end, these branches, and at the very, very end of the axon terminal are these synaptic end bulbs. And what did I say is stored in the synaptic end bulb? Let's just think of the end bulb is like a light bulb, like this. Okay. What's going to be stored in that end bulb? Neurotransmitters, especially acetylcholine. Okay. Now, right here in this section, this is where we have the end of the nerve and the beginning of the muscle. That's called the neuromuscular junction. And right between the nerve and the muscle, there is a space or a gap called a synaptic cleft. So let's take this and we're going to blow it up. Look to the right. Again, we could see the axon terminal. It's sending a nerve impulse to the very, very end of that axon terminal where we have a synaptic end bulb. And what did I say is stored in the synaptic end bulb? Well, we're going to have neurotransmitters, especially acetylcholine. So right here, there's a synaptic vesicle containing acetylcholine right here. That's one, and here's another. We can see lots of mitochondria, and we see another one here, and we see all of these are stored acetylcholine in these vesicles. And the goal is we're trying to get this neurotransmitter to communicate with the muscle side. This is the muscle side. But we don't call it a muscle side. We just say a motor end plate. The motor end plate, simply speaking, is the muscle side. Okay? So we want the acetylcholine to leave this end bulb and find a way to communicate with the muscle. And in order to do that, calcium is involved. Calcium influxes, right? You have influx or efflux. Influx means it's moving in, efflux means it's exiting. So calcium finds a way into the synaptic end bulb. And what calcium does, let's take a look at the bottom picture now. What calcium does, we'll star it here. Calcium has a major effect on those vesicles that have that neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Well, what does calcium do? Well, calcium allows that vesicle to open up and release its contents into this synaptic cleft, which is the space between the synaptic end bulb and the motor end plate. That space, that gap between the two, is the synaptic cleft. So calcium allows that vesicle to open up and release its contents to outside of the cell. There's a very important term for that called exocytosis. Exocytosis is a cell that has, let's say, a neurotransmitter, and now it's going to open up and allow those things to exit. In this case, calcium is affecting the uh, vesicle. It's going to allow the acetylcholine to move through the synaptic cleft, where it is going to bind, number two, it's going to bind to an acetylcholine receptor. These green receptors happen to be sodium channels. All that is a doorway or a window that's closed until acetylcholine hits it. It's like a lock and key. When acetylcholine binds to that channel or that receptor, the gate opens and sodium rushes in. And when sodium rushes in, that's what creates an action potential. We'll abbreviate action potential with AP, action potential. Now, this invagination, this indentation or invagination, this is the T tubule. That's a T tubule, which is this. That's where that action potential is going to travel and spread the information to the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium that will affect the myofibrils to make actin and myosin interact with one another to make it contract. So let's see if we can review some of this. We have a motor neuron, somatic motor neuron, right? These are the dendrites. This is the cell body. This is the axon. At the very end, you have axon collaterals and you have an axon terminal and you have a synaptic end bulb. Where that meets the motor end plate, that is the neuromuscular junction. So what's happening at that neuromuscular junction? So right here, this is going to be the synaptic end bulb. We're going to have calcium that comes in. It's going to allow the acetylcholine to enter the synaptic cleft. So calcium is going to allow the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in those vesicles to open up, exocytosis, and it's going to hit the motor end plate. It's going to hit those channels. When acetylcholine hits the channel, those sodium channels open up, and that's where sodium rushes in and creates the excitation or the action potential. This invagination is the exact same thing that we see here. And I said that's the T tubule. I said that's this, the transverse tubule, this thing. So what does, let me go back here for a second. What does the transverse tubule make contact with? Well, this transverse tubule makes contact with this, with this, with this. And what are these things part of? They're part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So here, the transverse tubule is butting right up against the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And what does the sarcoplasmic reticulum store? Sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium. So the calcium that's stored is released. And it's released and it's going to affect the myofibrils, thin and thick filaments. Those thin and thick filaments are the actin and myosin. Those are these things that you can see, like the red and the blue, a little bit deep, these horizontal lines. Those are actin and myosin. Those are myofibrils. Actin is thin, and the myosin is thick. Actin is thin. So we're going to have thin filaments, what we see here, that's actin. And then you're going to have the thicker ones in the middle, those are myosin. Those are myosin. Somehow the calcium that's being released is going to have major influence over actin and myosin to make a muscle contraction take place. And remember, contraction means to produce tension. Good place to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to get into the contractile proteins and how exactly will the sarcomere contract.